There is a certain kind of person who already knows something is wrong before anyone says a word. They walk into a room that looks completely normal, people laughing, glasses clinking, music playing, and within seconds, something registers. A laugh that lands a half beat too early, a smile that reaches the eyes just slightly too late, a sentence that sounds fine on the surface but carries a strange weight underneath. No one else notices. No one else is looking, but they are always looking. Most people would call this a gift. Emotional intelligence, depth, sensitivity. And in some ways, they're right. But what they don't see is the other side of that awareness, the one that doesn't clock out at the end of the day, the one that follows them into the car, into the shower, into the quiet moments before sleep when the mind finally has nothing to distract it and chooses, instead, to replay the dinner conversation from 3 nights ago to search for what was really meant by that one particular pause. This is the psychology of people who are too aware, and if that sounds familiar, it's probably not a coincidence. Where it begins. Before we get into how this shows up in daily life, we need to understand where it comes from. Because too much awareness doesn't appear randomly. It has a history. Some people are born with what researchers call sensory processing sensitivity, a trait found in roughly 15 to 20% of the population and studied extensively by psychologist Elaine Aron. Their nervous systems process incoming information more deeply than average, more layers, more nuance, more everything. The world, for them, has always arrived at full volume. But for many others, heightened awareness wasn't a birthright. It was a lesson, one the nervous system learned early, in an environment where reading the room wasn't optional. It was how you stayed safe. Think about what it means to grow up in a household where the emotional atmosphere could shift without warning, where a parent's mood determined whether dinner was warm or silent, where love sometimes felt conditional, and the only way to navigate that unpredictability was to become very, very good at detecting it before it arrived. The child in that environment doesn't learn hypervigilance from a book. Their brain builds it automatically. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, trains itself to stay alert, not to physical danger, but to emotional weather. And here is what's important to understand. That was intelligent. That was adaptive. The problem is that survival tools don't come with an off switch. The child grows up. The environment changes. But the nervous system keeps the setting it was given. It keeps scanning, even when there is nothing dangerous left to find. This is why overly aware people are not broken. They are not too sensitive or too complicated. They are carrying intelligence that was shaped by survival, and they never received permission to put it down. If this is already making sense of something you felt for a long time, you're in the right place. This channel exists for people who think deeply and feel carefully about the human mind. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We go to places most psychology content never reaches. Sign 1, you don't just hear words, you hear everything else too. For most people, communication is relatively straightforward. Someone says something, you take it at face value, you respond, you move on. For the overly aware person, a conversation is never just a conversation. It is a layered event. They are listening to the words, yes, but they're also tracking the pace of delivery. Did that come out faster than usual? They're registering the emotional charge underneath a neutral sentence. Why does "I'm fine" feel like a closed door? They notice when someone's answer is technically responsive, but emotionally evasive. They catch the micro-hesitation before a compliment. They feel the difference between laughter that comes from warmth and laughter that comes from discomfort. Psychologists call this kind of interpersonal sensitivity a heightened capacity for what's known as theory of mind, the ability to model another person's internal state. Most people do this in general terms. The overly aware person does it constantly, automatically, and in high resolution. The cost is significant. When every interaction contains this much data, the brain is never truly off. Neuroscience research on the default mode network, the brain system responsible for social cognition and self-referential thought, shows that in people with elevated social sensitivity. This network tends to stay more persistently active. The mental processing doesn't pause when the conversation ends. It continues long after, quietly running in the background, finishing what it started. They're not overthinking because something is wrong with them. They're finishing what their nervous system was trained to do. Sign 2. Your inner life has an inner critic watching it theirs, a concept in psychology called metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. The prefrontal cortex manages this process. Most people access it occasionally when they're reflecting or problem solving. For the overly aware, it's running in parallel with everything else, all the time. This means emotions don't arrive cleanly, they arrive accompanied. Sadness shows up, and immediately the observation begins, is this sadness proportionate? Is it about now, or is it old? Should I even be feeling this given everything I have? Joy arrives, and before it fully lands, part of the mind is already watching the joy from a distance, noting it, cataloging it, quietly wondering when it will end. It's like trying to enjoy a meal while simultaneously writing a review of it. The experience and the analysis compete for the same attention. Neither one gets to be complete. The irony is that this level of self-monitoring often comes from a deep desire to be emotionally responsible, to not burden others, to not overreact, to not take up too much space. But the mechanism meant to prevent emotional excess ends up preventing emotional presence. You're regulated to the point of being slightly absent from your own experience. Sign 3. You've lost the ability to take things at face value. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from seeing too clearly. Once you've learned to read beneath the surface of human behavior, once you've seen how often what people say and what they mean are two different things, how often warmth has conditions attached, how often apologies are conflict management rather than genuine accountability, you cannot simply stop seeing it. A compliment lands, and you feel its sincerity, but you also notice the timing, the context, the possible motivation. A friend says they're happy for you, and you believe them, mostly, but somewhere in the background your mind has already registered the slight flatness in their voice. An apology arrives, and you accept it, but you notice that it centered the apologizer's discomfort more than your experience. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition that has become too precise, and what it costs you is what psychologists might call relational innocence, the ability to receive things simply, to let a kind word just be a kind word, to let love be uncomplicated, at least for a moment. The result is a quiet kind of isolation, not because you push people away, but because you're always experiencing a slightly different version of the interaction than everyone else in the room. Sign 4. You feel other people's emotions in your own body. Empathy, for most people, is an act. You recognize someone's pain, you respond to it, you move on. For the overly aware person, empathy is more like a condition. It doesn't require a decision. It's already happening. You walk into a room where two people have clearly just argued, and your chest tightens before you've even registered why. A friend talks about their anxiety, and by the time the conversation ends, you're carrying something that doesn't quite belong to you, a residue that follows you into the evening. A colleague seems quietly off today, and even though they say nothing and you ask nothing, you spend the rest of the afternoon slightly weighed down by their unspoken mood. Research on mirror neurons, the neural systems that activate in response to observed emotional states, suggests that some nervous systems are considerably more responsive to these signals than others. For the deeply empathic person, the line between witnessing emotion and absorbing it is genuinely thin. The external picture looks like emotional intelligence, composure, warmth. The kind of person others describe as easy to talk to, the one who makes people feel understood. And that part is real. What people don't see is the accumulation. Every absorbed emotion, every managed atmosphere, every time you quietly recalibrated the energy in the room, it adds up. And because you're so good at holding it, very few people think to ask how you're doing with all of it. Sign 5. Your body registers things before your mind does. Awareness, for the overly aware person, is not purely cognitive. It lives in the body. Psychology refers to this as interoception, the capacity to sense and interpret the body's internal signals processed largely by the insular cortex. Heart rate, breath, tension in the chest or stomach, the subtle drop of energy that precedes a difficult conversation. In some nervous systems, this sensitivity is calibrated extremely high. The body becomes a constant information stream, not just about physical states, but emotional ones. You feel unease before you can name its source. You sense that a relationship has shifted before anything explicit has been said. You notice the tension in your own body that tells you, before any conscious thought arrives, that something in the room has changed. This is useful, often remarkably so, but without the ability to distinguish between signal and noise, it becomes overwhelming. Every flutter of the heart becomes something to interpret. Every drop in energy becomes a problem to investigate. The nervous system, originally trained to detect genuine threats, starts applying that same vigilance to ordinary life. And ordinary life starts to feel like it requires constant management. The trap. When awareness becomes armor. Here is where the gift quietly turns. At some point, the overly aware person begins to use their awareness not just to understand the world, but to stay ahead of it. If they can predict how a conversation will go, they won't be caught off guard. If they can read the early signs of someone pulling away, the eventual distance won't hurt as much. If they can map every possible outcome, they won't have to experience regret. Understanding becomes a form of self-protection. The mind runs simulations. It plays out versions of the future, tests their edges, prepares responses, builds contingency plans. Every relationship is quietly risk-assessed. Every decision carries the weight of anticipated consequences. Psychologists recognize this pattern as a feature of anxiety, specifically the way that hypervigilant individuals often attempt to neutralize uncertainty through preemptive thinking. The logic makes perfect sense from the inside. Preparation equals safety. But the cost is presence. To stay perpetually one step ahead, you have to remain perpetually outside the moment. Joy arrives, and part of you is already watching for when it ends. Connection forms, and your mind is already calculating the distance between where you are and where things could go wrong. This is how awareness quietly transforms from a lens into a cage. Not dramatically, gradually. Until the person who once simply felt everything deeply is now spending most of their energy managing the feeling rather than having it. What actually helps? The solution is not less awareness. That door doesn't open from the inside. What changes is the relationship to awareness, specifically the assumption that everything noticed must be responded to. That every signal is an assignment. That every insight carries an obligation. 3 shifts tend to matter most. The first is learning to notice without absorbing. Seeing that something is off in a room doesn't mean taking responsibility for it. Feeling a shift in someone's mood doesn't mean it belongs to you to resolve. Awareness can be an observation rather than a directive. This is a skill, and it takes practice, but it begins with the simple recognition that noticing and carrying are not the same thing. The second is allowing emotions to pass through instead of be processed. Not every feeling needs to be understood before it's allowed to leave. Anxiety can be acknowledged. Yes, my heart is beating faster. This is my nervous system doing what it learned to do, and then released, without being interrogated for meaning. The emotion was real. It doesn't also need to be a revelation. The third is trusting the present moment more than the simulated future. The mind that has spent years preparing for outcomes it predicted needs retraining, not through force, but through small, accumulating experiences of being present and finding that it was enough. That the conversation was fine. That the silence wasn't hostile. That the moment entered fully, didn't require managing. When these shifts take root, something changes. Not the awareness itself, but its texture. The ceiling light doesn't turn off. But it stops being a spotlight, cold, relentless, exposing everything. It becomes something softer, something that illuminates without demanding. The person who sees deeply still sees deeply. but they no longer have to carry everything they see. And that, finally, is what rest feels like. If any part of this felt familiar, if you recognized yourself in the constant analysis, the absorbed emotions, the body that knows things before the mind does, leave a comment with the sign that resonates most. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel a little less alone in the way their mind works. And if this channel is the kind of space you've been looking for, where psychology goes deeper than surface-level advice, subscribe. We'll keep going together. And to everyone who has already subscribed, thank you for being part of Human Thinking Lab. It means more than you know. See you in the next one.